What about all my confidential data, some of which I might have legislative obligations to keep confidential, and suddenly it's not over there in a computer in that room, it's...
And this has been a big issue because some Australian companies can't use the cloud because their cloud storage is not in Australia. And we're actually now starting to see cloud computing companies that are specifically located in Australia so that they can fulfill those requirements.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's how confidential is this data? Do I have restrictions over this data being stored? How do I know that my data is truly secure? And we've seen, 2010 was a series of data breaches in all of the major clouds. Some of them perhaps by nations breaking into clouds, some of them by hackers breaking into clouds and stealing the information that's been put up there by organizations.
So how can you, if I had a service on my house where they said, well, you don't have to lock your door anymore, we'll come around and lock it for you, I would feel more comfortable knowing that I was responsible for locking the door, because the consequences of it being unlocked are big. Can companies that supply cloud say with utter certainty and truth that the data will be as safe as if you're looking after it yourself?
Well,
yeah.
Okay, so the analogy sometimes I use is 100 years ago in the banking system. People were keeping their money under the mattresses because they did not trust the bank to store their money as good as they would do themselves. And that has shifted to everybody has their money in the bank.
Possibly depending on where you are in the GFC.
But went backwards a couple of years ago.
No, correct. But that's another very interesting analogy there if we take it to that level where at some point there was mistrust or a lower level of trust of banks, and there was a run to the bank and everybody wanted to withdraw that money. This is a little bit of the thinking you have to go through with the cloud. Do I trust the cloud provider to the level that I can have my data over there?
And there are certainly situations where there's going to be sort of legislation, privacy laws in various countries which may, depending on the type of data, actually restrict you from having it offshore. But, I completely agree, this issue of trust and service levels and dealing with a reputable set of suppliers. I mean, you want to make sure that they're going to be able to delete the data when it's finished, allow you to get the data out if you want to move it to somewhere else. I mean, there's some important attributes here that I think the IT industry delivering cloud services needs to to be really diligent about.
And the organisation, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
And this is, I think, where Glenn's point about private clouds versus public clouds becomes important, because if these issues are really starting to crowd out your decision making, that's when you should be building a private cloud, so that you actually, it's out there, but you have control.
And ultimately, over 3 to 5 years, I think we'll see many of these issues that are kind of bothering people and concerning people today get addressed. So if you're starting out and building your private cloud, you do that in a way that you can support migration into a hybrid or into a more public cloud in the future.
And that, in a sense, is why we're starting to see in the Australian market the greatest movement has been in commercial private clouds. Right. So it's a neat, simple step of saying, okay, I trust a group of companies to outsource my stuff to a data centre or to my infrastructure outsourcer. Now, in its simplest form, would you trust that same company keeping their data in the same place, sending it over the same network, but we're just doing it at a click charge rate? Now, at its simplest form, that's about as risky as the decision gets. You can start to look at all sorts of options that include greater risk, including offshore and all sorts of other things. But if security is your absolute concern, go to your existing service providers that you have contracts with today and ask them, do you have a cloud offering? Because that's a straightforward, simple question.
Reliability is important too, GP. Are providers of cloud able to guarantee particular levels of service?
There is some financial backed up SLA that we can get from the cloud, but it's interesting to see the type of thinking that large enterprises go through, compare that to the thinking and the thought process that small and medium businesses go through. For small and medium businesses, the cloud is way better than they were today. So they're comparing something that Microsoft might offer or other company might offer out there with some level of trust and reliability versus a PC or a server under my desk. Clearly, the cloud will be better than what I'm doing today. For larger enterprises that have processes and security teams and data center in place, the conversation is slightly different. My belief is that ultimately, professionals and people have as a profession, the operating of a cloud will be better off than a lot of industries where their core competency is not IT. Their core competency is banking, their core competency is financial services or whatever you. For them, what is best is to think about how to create the best mortgage I can, or is to understand how to create the best secure environment for my IT. My proposition is that they should be thinking more about their core businesses and start through the journey of trusting professionals in that particular
As long as they
matters.
do their due
No,
diligence.
of course, absolutely.
Yep.
And I often think you touched on security, which is one of the things that gets discussed a lot. And I think your point is a very valid one, that if I've got a reputable cloud provider and they do this stuff, they implement security well and they do it at scale, they're probably going to end up being able to do that better in some senses than most organisations can do themselves. And we've probably all been in organisations where you could drive a bus through the security of their own internal IT. So, what's sometimes perceived as a disadvantage, I think could actually ultimately deliver significant advantages.
And it is a sentence that I heard from a partner that I was working with. He said, "You cannot engineer trust.
Yeah.
No, you have to earn the trust." So it's by being out there and having evidence of reliability, of security, and so on and so forth, that people will start embracing your model.
Right?
There's another element to reliability, which is that once you're in the cloud, you are entirely dependent on the reliability of the network.
Yes.
And the network is only as reliable as any of the weakest links between you and it. And that could be, whether you in the office and your link goes down, or whether you at home and your crap DSL goes down, or whether you're out and your wireless goes down. And so you always have to think that once you've pushed things out to the cloud, you have introduced another element that can fail.
And this is where I think, we touched on IT skills before. So instead of being responsible for the delivery of the individual pieces, I think the role of the IT professional inside the organisation is going to be able to, it needs to evolve to understand all of those elements and what risks there are associated with them in order to build
And
resilient.
what backups you can put into place.
Exactly.
And there is evidence of that where quite a few consultancy firms are creating this IT risk management practice, or are growing the risk management practice that they have, because now IT is less about the delivery and more about the risk that I'm willing to take or not willing to take.
Well, I was just going to point to a question off Twitter. There's a bit of a trend in some of the comments that were coming through. I think one of the big things that people pointed to, and it kind of relates to both security and reliability, is the idea that, I guess, through all these layers of companies that potentially will be underlying your cloud infrastructure, that actually is both on the security question and the reliability question, extra points of failure that you might not even know about depending on who's providing the application. So I think people are still sort of thinking it's one thing to say that security is going to be okay, but how can people really feel that they can reliably know that this is really being looked after?
So to me, I go back to what I said earlier. I think you cannot engineer trust. You have to earn trust. So I don't think we're going to ever be able to show every single bits and every single line of cables that we're going to be using for providing that service. Just have to trust the company that provided that service that they can do it.
But there is going to be a requirement at a technical level to have infrastructure embedded within the cloud delivery stuff, so that if something goes wrong, I can see where the things have failed. And we have to do that in large complex IT environments today. We're going to have to do that in cloud delivered services. And again, it comes back to sort of standards. We're going to need to have agreed ways so that if my cloud infrastructure provider is here and my software provider is there, my network comes in here and something goes wrong, that all of those things have the appropriate infrastructure underneath them to enable me or some other service provider to help debug and sort things out.
And I guess the other thing is that people get very used to, don't they, giving very personal, confidential information to their doctor or their lawyer or their therapist, or, the first time your doctor tells you to pull down your pants, you're thinking, well, what's going on? And then the 10th time, it's just normal. So I suppose it is about getting into habits of trust. But then again, that trust has to be earned, as you were saying.
But I think there is also a mindset in IT where we want to know the inner things in order to be comfortable, whereas in many other industries, you don't need to know the inner things. So taking the electricity, you're not going to ask Energy Australia or whomever there, say, hey, what type of turbine are you using? Because I only want my electricity delivered with that type of turbine.
Yeah.
You just take the electricity as it comes
Having
out.
said that, though, electricity, you can draw the electricity analogy only so far. It's a reasonably simple service, 240 volts, 50 or 60 hertz. The services we're delivering over cloud are far more complex, so I think we still need to have a level of infrastructure to support that.
Let's talk about this, because I think what we're really asking for is transparency. If we have that all the way up, and that comes back to the electricity question is, you said that my electricity is being generated green. Can you actually prove that for me? Can I actually know this?
Yeah, right.
And so it is the same thing. Can I know things are secure because everything up the chain is transparent?
And just to keep on the electricity grids, they're getting far more complex these days. It's not just a single generator and a single transmission network. We've got solar cells on people's roofs and cogeneration, and that is increasing the complexity of managing and running those electricity grids. So I think by analogy in the IT space, we can't avoid it. We should do it in a standard way with good transparency. I think that's the
And
right
that's
approach.
a good doctor. If you go, why are you tapping my knee? They'll tell you. And if they say, look, I'm the doctor, I'm doing it, you won't go back.
There are also a few unsung heroes of enterprise IT whose time may have come. Your security people, your enterprise architects, the people who worry about whether all the bits fit together. Really, organisations shouldn't take risks, unnecessary risks. But on the other hand, if you took no risk at all, you'd get nowhere. And we need people within the IT organisations who not only know about building stuff, and that requirement's going to diminish a bit over time, but the people who understand what risk is reasonable, their time has really come. We've talked for years about it all being about data. Well, now it's time for us to get serious about data, because we have to understand the difference between data that can end up overseas to data that we really don't want to end up overseas. And if we can differentiate that, then we've got a chance of doing different things over the cloud.
One of the examples that came up a lot on Twitter and from Whitepacker readers was WikiLeaks, which both benefited from and got royally screwed over by cloud providers. Obviously, most businesses aren't actually as sort of controversial as WikiLeaks, but what can they learn from that whole experience?
I think you're right that the WikiLeaks experience. I think it's time for IT security people to dust off those old security plans and look at the fact that risks to companies has become significantly more post-WikiLeaks. We need to understand what it means to any company not to have a good and well-developed security plan.
Yes, and let me extend that. If you are doing something that other people are going to find objectionable, whether they're countries or anything else, then you probably should have a very, very strong private cloud strategy thought out before you start pissing people off. Because the problem was that they had to migrate to a public cloud, and the public cloud could be turned off. There was a beautiful article that's in the New York Times today about the kill switch in Egypt and what it actually took to turn off the internet in Egypt. And it wasn't particularly easy. And it wasn't particularly perfect, but it turns out that all of our systems, this is going to be as true in Australia as anywhere else in the world, all of our systems are so interconnected globally that if you pull the plugs on the systems, on the cables that run from Australia to the rest of the world, all of our systems will more or less fail because they depend on information that's constantly flowing in from those other systems.
So just to complement on that, I think what you mentioned, that WikiLeaks benefited from the massive scale that they were able to tap into, and then when they were not welcome anymore, they were constrained to shut down. So this is a little bit like, to take another analogy that we use electricity, is having a power generator in your garage. So you rely on the public infrastructure as long as you can, and when this goes away, you have a backup that might not be as powerful or as complete that we can get from the public infrastructure, but you can have your survival systems still
Candles.
Running. Candles, yeah, if you want. Yeah. I'm younger than you, so.
They remember candles.